There are some victories in war that never make it into the history books, some acts of courage so extraordinary they seem impossible, and some men whose names should be known by every schoolchild but instead were buried beneath decades of silence and segregation. This is the story of one such man, a black Marine who was never supposed to be in combat, never supposed to prove himself, never supposed to survive what happened on a nameless ridge in the Pacific where the jungle breathed with death, and the enemy moved like ghosts through the darkness. His name was Private First Class Luther Woodward, and on a night in 1944 when everything went wrong, when his unit was cut off and surrounded, when trained white officers froze in terror, he did something that military tacticians still study today, something that saved 37 lives and changed the course of a battle that history almost forgot. The year was 1943 when Luther Woodward stepped off the segregated train in North Carolina and walked through the gates of Montford Point, the only training facility in the entire United States Marine Corps that would accept black recruits. The Marines had resisted integration longer than any other branch, clinging to the myth that black men lacked the discipline, the intelligence, the courage required to wear the eagle, globe, and anchor. It took a direct order from President Roosevelt and the desperate need for bodies to feed the Pacific meat grinder before the Corps grudgingly opened its doors. And even then, they made sure those doors led to a separate, unequal world. Montford Point was built on swampland, the barracks were substandard, the training was deliberately brutal, designed not just to prepare men for war, but to break them, to prove the racist assumptions that black men didn't belong. The white drill instructors were often the ones who had washed out of regular Marine training, sent to this backwater post as punishment, and they brought their bitterness and their prejudice with them like weapons. Luther was 22 years old, tall and lean, with hands that had picked cotton in Georgia, and a mind that had devoured every book he could borrow from the colored library in his hometown. His father had been a sharecropper who died young from a combination of hard work and harder times, and his mother cleaned white people's houses 6 days a week, coming home with her back bent and her spirits somehow still unbroken. She had taught Luther to read before he started school, had told him that knowledge was the one thing white folks couldn't take away, and he had believed her with the fierce faith of a child who understands that education is not just power, but survival. When the war came, Luther could have stayed home, could have taken a defense job in Atlanta or Detroit, but something in him needed to prove what he already knew, that courage has no color, that honor doesn't check the shade of your skin before it settles in your heart. So he volunteered for the Marines, the hardest, proudest branch, the one that didn't want him, because he understood that the greatest victories are won not just against the enemy in front of you, but against the lies they tell about who you are and what you're worth. The training at Montford Point was hell wrapped in humiliation. They ran until men collapsed, crawled through mud and barbed wire until their uniforms were shredded and their skin was torn, did push-ups in the rain while sergeants screamed that they were proving every stereotype true, that they'd never be real Marines, that they'd fold the first time they heard enemy fire. But something unexpected happened in that crucible of deliberate cruelty. The men of Montford Point denied the respect they deserved, denied even basic dignity, forged something stronger than the brotherhood the white Marines took for granted. They held each other up, literally and figuratively, pulling struggling recruits through obstacle courses, sharing extra rations with those who were sick, studying together in the evenings because they understood that every failure would be used as evidence against their entire race. Luther became a quiet leader, not through volume or bravado, but through competence and calm. He could field strip a rifle faster than anyone in his platoon, could read a map like he'd drawn it himself, and had a way of seeing terrain, understanding how ground and vegetation and sight lines could be used or exploited. That made even the most racist instructor pause and take notice. They graduated in the spring of 1944, these Montford Point Marines. And instead of being sent to combat units where they might prove themselves in battle, most were assigned to labor battalions, ammunition supply companies, jobs that were necessary but deliberately kept away from glory. The official line was that black Marines weren't ready for combat, that they needed more seasoning, but everyone knew the truth. That the Corps couldn't stomach the idea of black men being heroes, couldn't risk them coming home with medals and stories that would shatter the comfortable fiction of white supremacy. But the Pacific War was a grinding, brutal campaign that consumed men faster than the military could replace them. And by late 1944, the segregated supply units were being pushed closer and closer to the fighting, not out of respect, but out of necessity. Luther's company was stationed on Peleliu, that hellish coral island where the Japanese had built a fortress of caves and tunnels, where every yard was paid for in blood and the casualty rates were so high that some units simply ceased to exist. It was October, the battle for Peleliu officially over, though the dying continued. When Luther's ammunition supply company was ordered to move supplies to a forward position on the northern ridges where isolated pockets of Japanese soldiers still held out, it should have been routine, a convoy of trucks moving under the cover of darkness. But intelligence had underestimated how many enemy troops remained, had failed to understand that the Japanese on Peleliu weren't retreating or surrendering, but fighting with the desperate ferocity of men who knew they were already dead and wanted only to take as many Americans with them as possible. The convoy was hit just after midnight, a sudden explosion that turned the lead truck into a ball of flame, followed by machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Muzzle flashes in the jungle darkness like malevolent fireflies. The Marines scattered, taking cover behind vehicles and rocks, returning fire at shadows while their white lieutenant, a 23-year-old from Alabama who had never hidden his contempt for the black men under his command, shouted contradictory orders that only added to the chaos. Luther had been riding in the third truck, and when the shooting started, he rolled into a ditch, his rifle clutched tight, his training overriding the natural terror that makes men freeze. He could hear the Japanese moving, hear the rustle of vegetation that didn't match the wind, the soft click of metal on stone that meant someone was repositioning. And he realized with sick clarity that they were being surrounded, that the ambush wasn't random but tactical, designed to trap them on this stretch of narrow road with jungle on both sides and nowhere to run. The other Marines were firing wildly, wasting ammunition on ghosts, and the lieutenant was screaming into his radio for support that wouldn't arrive in time if it arrived at all. Luther understood in that moment of crystalline focus that combat sometimes brings that they were going to die here. All of them, unless someone took control, unless someone did something impossible. He crawled forward, moving from shadow to shadow until he reached the lieutenant's position. The young officer's face was pale, even in the darkness, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that erases training and reveals what a man truly is. Luther said, low and urgent, that they needed to fall back to a defensive position, that staying on the road was suicide, but the lieutenant just stared at him, and Luther saw in that stare a lifetime of being told that black men were inferior, incapable of leadership, fit only to follow. And he understood that this white boy would rather die than take advice from someone who looked like Luther. So Luther made a choice that could have gotten him court-martialed or killed by his own side. He turned to the Marines nearest him, all black men from his own company, and he said, quietly but with absolute authority to follow him, that he was getting them out of this. They moved as a unit, 8 men, including Luther, crawling and running in bursts, using the terrain the way Luther had learned to read it, finding the low ground and the dead spaces where the Japanese fire couldn't reach. Behind them, the trapped convoy continued to fight and die. But Luther's mind was racing ahead, calculating angles and possibilities. He realized that the Japanese patrol wasn't large, maybe 15 or 20 men, but they had positioned themselves perfectly. 3 sides of a box, with the jungle as the fourth wall. The standard response would be to hunker down and wait for reinforcements, to trade casualties for time, but Luther had grown up hunting in Georgia, stalking deer through pine forests, and he understood something about predators and prey, about how confidence makes you careless. The Japanese expected the Marines to be pinned, expected them to be terrified and disorganized, and that expectation was a weakness Luther could exploit. He led his small group in a wide arc through the jungle, moving parallel to the road but far enough out that they were beyond the Japanese perimeter. It was slow, dangerous work, every step a potential death trap, booby traps, and unseen sentries. But Luther moved with a patience that seemed impossible under the circumstances, testing the ground before committing his weight, freezing at the slightest sound. Using hand signals he had improvised because the official Marine Corps signals weren't designed with black ingenuity in mind. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, they had circled behind the Japanese position, and Luther could see them now. Shadows crouched in fighting positions, their attention focused forward on the killing zone where the convoy burned. He counted heads, assessed their weapons and spacing, and realized they had brought ammunition but not much water, that they were operating as a harassment unit, planning to strike and fade back into the jungle before American reinforcements could trap them. What Luther did next wasn't in any manual, wasn't something they taught at Montford Point or anywhere else. He had his men spread out in a line behind the Japanese position, spacing themselves so they looked like a larger force. And then he did something that would have gotten him labeled crazy if it hadn't worked. He started making noise deliberately, cracking branches and rustling bushes, creating the impression of a platoon-sized force moving through the jungle. The Japanese heard it, heard what sounded like a relief column approaching from their rear, and they did exactly what Luther had gambled they would do. Panicked. Not the wild, screaming panic of broken soldiers, but the tactical panic of men who suddenly realize they're the ones trapped, who understand that the ambush has become a potential encirclement. The Japanese commander, invisible in the darkness but present in the sudden change of enemy fire, made the decision to withdraw, to fade back into the jungle before they could be caught between two American forces. But Luther wasn't done. As the Japanese began to pull back, moving in a ragged line through the jungle, Luther had his men open fire. Short, controlled bursts that sounded like they came from multiple positions, reinforcing the illusion of a larger force. The psychological effect was devastating. The Japanese, already rattled, began to run, discipline breaking as each man made his own decision about survival. Luther's small group pursued them for maybe 200 yards, keeping up the fire, keeping up the illusion, driving them like game animals until they scattered completely into the deep jungle where they were no longer a cohesive threat. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The night fell silent except for the crackle of burning vehicles and the moans of wounded men. Luther led his group back to the convoy, moving carefully because he knew the Marines there were terrified and likely to shoot at anything that moved. He called out the password, identified himself, and emerged from the jungle to find the lieutenant sitting on the ground, his rifle across his knees, looking like he had aged a decade in an hour. The relief force arrived 20 minutes later, a full platoon of white Marines expecting to find a massacre, and instead found the convoy mostly intact, casualties surprisingly light, and a very confused lieutenant trying to explain what had happened, without mentioning that a black private had taken command and executed a tactical maneuver that bordered on brilliant. But the other Marines knew, both black and white. They had heard Luther giving orders, had seen him move with purpose when everyone else was paralyzed with fear. And word spread the way truth always does in combat, person to person. A whispered legend that couldn't be officially acknowledged but couldn't be denied. Luther Woodward never received a medal for what he did that night. The official after-action report credited the lieutenant with executing a successful defensive withdrawal and mentioned that enemy forces had been driven off by the timely arrival of reinforcements. Luther's name didn't appear anywhere in the commendation, and when he was asked about it years later, he just shrugged and said that staying alive was reward enough, that he did what needed doing because those were his brothers, his fellow Marines, and you don't abandon your brothers regardless of what color skin they're wearing. What that 1944 report couldn't say in a segregated military afraid of a black hero was that Luther Woodward showed tactical brilliance and leadership worthy of an officer. He saved 37 lives through courage, intelligence, and improvisation, outthinking a full Japanese patrol. And he did it while fighting two wars at once, the one before him and the one that denied his humanity. The Montford Point Marines would go on to serve throughout the Pacific War, at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and a dozen other places where history was written in blood and sacrifice. They would prove, over and over, what should never have needed proving, that courage knows no color, that excellence can emerge from any zip code or skin tone, that the only thing that matters when bullets are flying is the person next to you and whether they'll stand when everything in them screams to run. Luther survived the war, came home to a Georgia that still made him use separate water fountains and sit in the back of the bus, worked as a mechanic and raised 4 children, and never talked much about what he'd done until the very end when the Montford Point Marines were finally belatedly recognized by a military that had spent decades pretending they didn't exist. He received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2012, along with the other surviving Montford Point Marines. Men in their 80s and 90s wearing dress blues that hung loose on frames bent by time, standing as straight as they could while a nation that had denied them said thank you. Finally, inadequately, but said it nonetheless. Luther Woodward died in 2015 at the age of 94. Surrounded by family, his mind still sharp enough to remember that night on Peleliu when he had looked at an impossible situation and decided that impossible was just another word for difficult. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service in a single line, made no mention of the ambush or the lives saved or the tactical brilliance that military historians would study decades later when the classified reports were finally unsealed. But his grandchildren knew, and his great-grandchildren are learning. And perhaps that's the way these stories survive, passed down like heirlooms, polished by retelling until they shine with the truth that was always there. That heroism doesn't require permission or recognition, that it simply is. A decision made in darkness by someone who refuses to let fear or injustice be the final word. The Pacific War claimed over 100,000 American lives, and among those casualties were thousands of black servicemen whose contributions were minimized, whose heroism was attributed to white officers, whose names disappeared into the vast bureaucratic machinery that turns individuals into statistics. The Montford Point Marines were part of that erasure, men who did everything asked of them and more, who fought not just for victory but for the right to be seen as equal, to be recognized as men. Luther Woodward's story is just one thread in that larger tapestry of forgotten courage. But it's a thread worth pulling because it unravels the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about the past, forces us to confront the truth that excellence was always present in black communities, in black soldiers, in black lives, and the only thing that made it invisible was our collective choice not to see. There's a photograph of Luther from 1945 taken just after VJ Day, showing him standing on a beach somewhere in the Pacific, his uniform crisp, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face unsmiling but his eyes holding something that might be satisfaction, or might be sadness, or might be the complex mixture of both that comes from surviving something you never should have had to face. He looks like any other Marine in any other victory photo, and that ordinariness is the point. The radical statement that black men in uniform are simply men in uniform, neither more nor less than their white counterparts, deserving of the same honor and the same history. Behind him in the photograph, you can see other Marines, black and white, together in that moment before segregation reasserted itself stateside. And you can almost imagine what might have been if that temporary unity had been allowed to continue, if the courage displayed on battlefields had translated into justice at home. But history doesn't deal in might have beens, only in what was and what we choose to remember about what was. Luther Woodward outsmarted a Japanese patrol on a dark night in 1944 because he had to, because the alternative was death for him and his brothers, because no one else was going to save them, so he saved himself and them through sheer force of will and intelligence. He did it without glory or recognition, did it knowing that his name would never be in the newspapers or the history books. Did it because that's what Marines do, what soldiers do, what human beings do when they're pushed to the edge and have to choose between surrender and survival. His story isn't unique. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of black servicemen who did similar things during World War II, who displayed tactical brilliance and physical courage and moral strength in situations that would have broken lesser men. And their stories are only now beginning to emerge from the shadows where they were deliberately placed by a society that couldn't reconcile their heroism with its prejudice. We owe Luther Woodward more than a medal awarded 7 decades too late. We owe him the truth, the full accounting of what he did and why it mattered, the acknowledgement that his intelligence and courage altered the outcome of a battle and saved lives and contributed to the ultimate victory over fascism, even as he was fighting his own battle against a different kind of fascism at home. We owe him the recognition that his story is American history. Not black history or military history, but the story of who we are and who we've been. The good and the terrible, the heroic and the shameful, all mixed together in the complex reality of a nation still learning what it means to live up to its stated ideals. Luther Woodward was a Marine, and he was a hero, and he was a black man in America. And all three of those identities shaped what he did and how he's remembered. And to honor him properly requires honoring all three simultaneously, refusing to separate them into comfortable categories that allow us to celebrate the heroism while ignoring the injustice. On quiet nights when the war has become history and the veterans have become memory, when the battles are studied in classrooms and the strategies are dissected by people who never heard a shot fired in anger, somewhere in that accumulated knowledge should be the name Luther Woodward and the story of what he did when everything went wrong and someone had to be brave enough and smart enough to make it right. His story is a reminder that greatness isn't distributed according to melanin. That tactical genius can emerge from a sharecropper's son who picked cotton before he picked up a rifle. That the ability to lead men under fire has nothing to do with which water fountain you're allowed to use. And that the real victory in any war is not just defeating the enemy, but expanding our understanding of who counts as hero, who deserves to be remembered, whose courage we choose to celebrate. Luther Woodward earned his place in history on a nameless ridge in the Pacific, and history has been slow to honor that debt. But the debt remains, and we are the ones who must pay it with our attention, with our respect, with our determination to ensure that never again will valor be erased because it comes wrapped in the wrong color skin. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video because it truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. Stories that were deliberately buried. Stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about courage and war and the men who fought in the shadows while others took the credit. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us if you knew about the Montford Point Marines before today. Tell us about the veterans in your own family whose stories deserve to be heard. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history, who fought 2 wars and won them both even if victory looked different than they deserved, who proved through blood and sacrifice and unshakable dignity that excellence has no color and heroism asks no permission before it acts. These stories matter. They shape who we are and who we can become. And every view, every like, Every share helps ensure that men like Luther Woodward are finally rightfully remembered as the heroes they always were.